Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome back. And I hope all of you are doing very well after the weekend. And so, welcome back. We are discussing the paper Introduction to International Relations. And right, so as part of your syllabus, we are starting the second module today, which is a very important one. The first unit, there are 3 units in your syllabus. Now, you all are very well versed with that. And out of the 3 units, we have covered the first one, which is the theory or different theoretical approaches or perspectives on the international relations. And now we are starting with the second one, which talks about the Cold War. What is Cold War and where was Cold War fought, if that was fought, meaning and its origin, emergence of different superpowers at this time. So basically, the second unit is all about theory से निकल के we are moving towards the empirical or the practical side, where we see what was the actual situation in the world stage at that time. How were what was international politics, how it looked like at that time. Just 1 second. Yeah. Okay. Just a second. Yeah. Right. So. So as you can see on your screens, the topic today is Cold War, its origin and its evolution, within which we will try to understand Cold War क्या है, what is Cold War, which we are giving reference to, और इसका evolution कैसे हुआ, कैसे emerge किया ये world scene पे, this whole idea of Cold War, and then the phases of Cold War. 1, 2, 3. If there are many phases, there are 3 phases which I'm going to deal with today. So what are these phases look like? Okay. So just 1 second. Okay. Yeah. All right. So yes. All right, let's begin with the introduction first. Let me introduce the idea of Cold War to you first. इसको शीत युद्ध क्यों कहते हैं, Cold War क्यों कहते हैं, कब के पीरियड के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. That's what we are going to talk about. So the Cold War was more than a rivalry between two superpowers. एक चीज आप लोगों को समझनी चाहिए that हम अब इस पीरियड पे पहुंच गए हैं जो हम World War I और World War II के बाद के डिस्कशंस हैं. आफ्टर World War I लिबरलिज्म या उदारवादी सोच का का अनुभव किया पूरे वर्ल्ड ने, और उसके बाद इतनी ताकत नहीं थी उस सोच में that it could prevent wars, that it could contain wars, and then World War II happened, right? So World War II happened, and right now हम जिस Cold War की बात कर रहे हैं वो एक ऐसा टाइम है जो यहाँ पीरियड मेंशन है 1945 से 1990 तक चला और वर्ल्ड में देखा गया. ऑलराइट, सो दिस इज द लॉन्गेस्ट पीरियड एवर, जिसके बीच में बहुत तरह के अलाइज डेवलप हुई, बहुत सारे आपसी संबंध बने देशों के बीच में, और बहुत सारे संबंध टूटे और जुड़े. तो इसी उतार चढ़ाव को बेसिकली वी आर गोइंग टू एनालाइज एंड वी आर लुकिंग एट. लेकिन सबसे बड़ी बात जो है Cold War के बारे में वो ये है दैट दिस इज बेसिकली बिटवीन टू मेजर सुपर पावर्स. आफ्टर World War II सब कुछ बहुत सारे डिस्ट्रक्शन होने के बाद, सारे नेगोशिएशंस और ट्रीटीज होने के बाद ये रियलाइज हुआ बाय फार दैट जियोग्राफिकली एंड ऑल्सो इकोनॉमिकली दो ऐसे कंट्रीज हैं दोस्त इमर्ज एज सुपर पावर्स, यूएसए एंड यूएसएसआर, सोवियत यूनियन, राइट. सो इन दो सुपर पावर्स के बीच की जो एक आइडियोलॉजिकल सोच की और समझ की और आकांक्षाओं की जो एक लड़ाई है उसको हम Cold War के रूप में देखते हैं. Okay, so let's move ahead. So the period of this war, that is between 1945 and 1990, also contained a history of international politics of a very different kind. Because ऐसा जो space है वो बाद में भी कभी विटनेस नहीं किया गया और उससे पहले भी कभी नहीं देखा गया था. It's very unique. Okay, that is the reason हम जब international relations के किसी भी idea को रेफर करते हैं, international studies के बारे में बात करते हैं, so we can't help but refer to this period. It's very very important. Okay, so the Cold War period saw the evolution of a world order where diplomacy and negotiation in their various forms were established. बहुत तरह की नीतियां और बहुत तरह के negotiations countries के बीच में देखे गए, as I told you. So it added a very different dimension to military build-up. एक और जो साइड उस समय देखा गया वो ये है कि all the countries by far were engaged in developing their military might. Militarily everybody wanted to secure themselves because they had already witnessed 2 wars now. World War I हुआ, 1 के बाद League of Nations आया, उदारवादी सोच आई, लेकिन फिर भी जो एक्सपेंशनिस्ट आइडिया है कि हमें अपनी कॉलोनीज बनानी है, हमें अपने आप को डेवलप करना है ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ एक्सप्लॉइटिंग अदर्स और मे बी टेकिंग ओवर और रूलिंग अदर्स, वो आइडिया जो है वो कंटेन नहीं हो पाया यूरोप में, एंड दैट लेड टू World War II. तो World War II में ये साबित हो गया दैट मिलिट्री माइट जो है वो ही सही मायने में एक देश को सिक्योरिटी प्रदान कर सकती है. सो अ वेरी डिफरेंट डायमेंशन अदर देन पॉलिटिकल डिप्लोमेसी या राजनीति कूटनीति, ये सब के अलावा मिलिट्री के ऊपर जो एक्सेंट है, सिक्योरिटी के ऊपर जो आपका आइडिया है, उसमें बहुत सारे चेंजेस नजर आए. इसमें क्या क्या चेंजेस, किस तरह के चेंजेस हमने देखे कि मिलिट्री वाइज ऑल्सो ब्लॉक्स बनते गए. एक ग्रुप और 2 ग्रुप और 3 ग्रुप. प्रॉक्सी वॉर्स मतलब बहुत सारे कंट्रीज का अपने आप में आपस में छोटे सिविल वॉर्स हों या आपस में वॉर्स हों, वो होती रही. नॉट रियली वर्ल्ड वॉर बट देयर वाज अनरेस्ट इन द होल वर्ल्ड. आर्म्स रेस, कौन किससे ज्यादा अपने आप को मिलिट्री ताकतवर बना सकता है, इसके ऊपर चर्चाएं शुरू हो गई और काम करना शुरू हो गए कंट्रीज. इट वाज फेल्ट कि अपने आप को मिलिट्री मजबूत करना बहुत जरूरी है. ये World War II के बाद की एक सोच है. ओके, सो द साइमल्टेनिटी ऑफ द एक्जिस्टेंस ऑफ यूनाइटेड नेशंस इज परहैप्स अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट डायमेंशन टू द एवोल्यूशन ऑफ कोल्ड वॉर. एक और बहुत यूनिक चीज उसमें भी 1946 में यूनाइटेड नेशंस एस्टैब्लिश हुआ. हालांकि लीग ऑफ नेशंस फेल हो चुका था, लेकिन फिर भी लोगों में ये इसमें कोई दो राय नहीं थी दैट एक आपस में पीस रखने के लिए बहुत जरूरी है दैट वन इंटरनेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन हैज टू बी एस्टैब्लिश्ड सो दैट इट मेंटेन्स अ बेसिक लॉ एंड ऑर्डर इन द इंटरनेशनल अरीना. सो इस बेसिक आइडिया के साथ यूनाइटेड नेशंस का जन्म हुआ. यूनाइटेड नेशंस जो है एक बहुत बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट डायमेंशन है कोल्ड वॉर के लिए या कोल्ड वॉर की शुरुआत के लिए, बिकॉज एटलीस्ट यूनाइटेड नेशंस ने ये किया कि एक और वर्ल्ड वॉर होने नहीं दिया. एटलीस्ट इट प्रिवेंटेड दैट. सो द वॉर कंटिन्यूड इन द फॉर्म ऑफ कोल्ड वॉर बट इट वाज नॉट अ रियल वॉर लाइक World War I or II. Okay. So it is said that today's contemporary world is poles apart and very dynamic from what it was in 1945. So ये जो dynamism है जो हम आज experience कर रहे हैं और today's world what we are living in is perhaps also a result of what happened from 45 onwards. And crucial period being Cold War period, that is 1945 से 1990. तो ये 45 से 90 तक के जो डेवलपमेंट्स है उसको हम कोल्ड वॉर भी कहते हैं, और उसकी वजह से उनको हम समझ लें तो वी कैन अंडरस्टैंड कि आज के डेट में व्हाटएवर इज हैपनिंग यूक्रेन में हो या कहीं पे हो, एवरीथिंग इज समवेयर आल्सो यू गो बैकवर्ड्स, यू कैन रिलेट टू दैट हिस्ट्री. ओके, सो व्हाई इज इट कॉल्ड कोल्ड वॉर? कोल्ड वॉर क्यों कहते हैं हम इसे? Isn't it perplexing to say that certain war is described as cold? War is always hot. ये एक आइडिया है because war में क्या होता है, we use weapons and armies and there is some strategic goal कि हमें इनको अटैक करना है, we have to take over this place. But this is called cold. Why this is called cold? We need to understand its very unique word which is used for this period, Cold War. What we know is that Cold War continued for more than 4 decades, right? 1945 to 1990 is a long period. The war touched the entire world, all the countries. It's not, of course, it was majorly between the two superpowers, but it also touched upon all the countries. Actually, it divided several countries and also prompted them to join hands with one or the other political or military blocs. All right. One very important feature of Cold War was thus bloc politics. Okay. Two blocs were created. So that's why we called it a bipolar world. Bi means two. So it was divided into two blocs. Two superpowers, United States of America and erstwhile USSR, Soviet Union, right? So these two blocs were created, and between these two superpowers, all the other countries were divided. So in this process, क्या हुआ? Millions of people suffered in various different ways. There were deaths, there were persecution, disappearance, economic development was disrupted, and also in cases it denied result of leading to hunger, poverty. You know, बहुत सारे लोग कम्युनिज्म के नाम पे और एंटी कम्युनिज्म रिबेलियंस के नाम पे सिविल वॉर्स हुए, और सबसे ज्यादा अफेक्टेड एरियाज कौन से थे? अफ्रीका, एशिया, लैटिन अमेरिका, कैरिबियन आइलैंड्स, besides the Eastern Europe, Balkans and other parts of the world. You'll notice that all these parts of the world which I'm talking were relatively less developed at that time. Economically, they were not so developed. That's why they were, the impact was seen majorly on these countries. ठीक है, मेजर लड़ाई जो है, मेजर जो impact है, वो इन countries पे दिखा गया. All right. So despite these sufferings on record, interestingly, we still continue to call this 45-year long war as the Cold War. This is ironic because so much destruction had taken place, so many people suffered, so many communities wiped off, and still we are calling it a Cold War. Anyway, interestingly, another very interesting fact about this war is that American and Soviet armies, they never fought face to face in the battlefield, even if this whole period was so long, 1945 to 90, but they never fought face to face in the battlefield. It was not like that. So why is it called Cold War? The aim is to convey that it was basically fought under an ideological cover. The war saw intense competition between two mutually hostile political ideologies. Basically, ये लड़ाई सिर्फ और सिर्फ political नहीं थी, but ideological भी थी. So these were capitalism and socialism. दो तरीके की सोच आपस में टकरा रही थी. Capitalism जो कि उदारवादी डेमोक्रेसी, लिबरल डेमोक्रेसी, फ्री मार्केट इकोनॉमी में बिलीव रखता है, and there is socialism which champion state ownership, nationalization, and workers' rights, egalitarian system, मतलब equality हो, political system, economic system, उसमें बिलीव करता है. और ये दोनों divided थे. United States being the leadership, providing the leadership to capitalist world, and Soviet Union to the socialist bloc. Okay, right. So this intense ideological competitiveness gave rise to bloc rivalry. Two blocks were created. तो ये सिर्फ geographically separation नहीं था, but ideological भी था. This was a signpost of 45-year-old Cold War when the Soviets, for example, initiated the Molotov plan in 1947 for its Eastern European allies to aid them and rebuild their ailing economies. The Americans responded with multi-billion-dollar Marshall Plan or the European Recovery Program in 48 for the post-World War II sick economies of the Western Europe. Now, very interestingly, now we are discussing how they moved ahead. सबसे पहले Molotov plan आया 1947 में, which was basically a system which was created by the Soviet Union for its Eastern European allies. उन्होंने geographically अपने आप को ईस्ट और वेस्ट में बांट लिया था. तो Eastern European allies, those who were struggling with economic restructuring, World War II ने इतना destruction फैलाया था that all these economies were suffering from major setback. They had become very poor, and economic restructuring और rebuilding के लिए Molotov plan launch किया Soviet Union ने for its allies, उनके अपने जो दोस्त थे उनके लिए. So similarly, 1948 में Americans ने भी आंसर बैक किया by giving out the Marshall Plan. So Marshall Plan was European Recovery Program for the Western Europe allies of USA. Okay, so Marshall Plan was in force only for 4 years, but Molotov Plan जो है वो तब तक रहा जब तक कि USSR रहा, that is 1991 तक. So in the name of Comecon, it was still alive. Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. ये जो Comecon है ये alive था till USSR was very much there, and it used to provide aid and help to the Eastern European countries which needed help or restructuring of their economy. So similarly, when the American side, ये हुआ economic side में इन लोगों ने अपना दो blocks create किए. So military side में क्या हुआ? American side ने क्या किया? They founded the Intergovernmental Military Alliance called the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. So Soviet कैसे चुप रहता? So Soviet side also had rebelled them with signing of Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, Mutual Assistance, जिसको हम कहते हैं Warsaw Pact 1955 में. Okay, so basically this was a friendship pact between the Eastern European countries, and NATO was operational in the Western European countries. So these ideological underpinnings and bloc rivalry impressed the observers of the war to qualify it as cold. So they were basically against each other. हर एक move जो है, they were against each other. They were fighting the battle, but not openly. That's why it's called Cold War. So it did not involve any direct military confrontations, direct war, but led to the division of the world. धीरे-धीरे, चाहे वो military तरीके से हो, चाहे वो economic तरीके से हो. So they were dividing it up, different organizations बना के एक division create कर रहे थे. That's how it is called Cold War. Okay, so this has led to many to characterize the Cold War as non-military conflict. Obviously, because military expansion was not the idea. The idea was कि हम धीरे-धीरे will take it over. Like who is more powerful इसी में पता चल जाएगा. So more nuanced meanings, however, of the Cold War sits between the ideological cover and the so-called non-military conflict. Since it was non-military, it was long and also very persistent. Some describe Cold War as a collection of low-intensity conflicts. Of course, the two sides fought several proxy wars. Proxy wars in the sense that they were not huge wars involving many countries, but yeah, chut-put conflicts जो है वो emerge करते रहते थे in the regions of Africa, Asia, Latin America. That was also another feature of Cold War. Okay, so now let's go and see. Let's take a look at the origin of the Cold War. There are two main explanations. दो reason आप दे सकते हैं origin of Cold War देने की. There are two ways of looking at it. Two explanations. One is the geopolitical explanation, the other one being the ideological. So what is the geopolitical explanation? Let's look at it. Some historians trace the origins of the Cold War to the Soviet Socialist Revolution of 1917, जिसको popularly हम लोग Bolshevik Revolution भी कहते हैं. Okay, 1917 में एक रेवोल्यूशन, एक क्रांति हुई, एंड द यूरोपियन मिलिट्री इंटरवेंशन इन रशिया इन 1918 टू स्कटल द फर्स्ट सोशलिस्ट स्टेट इन द वर्ल्ड. बोल्शेविक रेवोल्यूशन 1917 के बाद ही बेसिकली यूएसएसआर को एस्टैब्लिश इटसेल्फ इन द वर्ल्ड मैप वेरी क्लियरली एज अ सुपरपावर. Okay. Other scholars see the origin of the World War to the military pacts and their violations between the European great powers immediately prior to and in the course of the Second World War. जितने भी पहले भी we have already discussed that after the World War I there was a kind of expectation, at least from the US side, that liberal Woodrow Wilson के 14-point program के बाद, that liberal ideas आने के बाद very positive thinking has emerged in the world and nobody would actually talk about expansionism and exploitation, यानी कि colonial rule को curtail करने का एक तरीका था. But यूरोप में ऐसा नहीं हुआ. The European great powers still they engaged in this expansionist policy and we saw it during the course of Second World War II. So the military pacts which were taking place and all these together are the reason why this Cold War happened. But however, the Cold War is widely believed to have begun in 1945. This was the time when we assigned ourselves. This was the time when the Soviet and the Americans had started seeing themselves as two most powerful nations in the West. This perception was at the core that also nurtured the expansionist aspirations that were believed as incompatible among the Soviets and the Americans in terms of their own power and capability. So this view understands, ये geopolitical क्या है? ये कहता है that according to this view, it understands the Cold War from the angle of power, capability and expansionist aspiration. It's called a geopolitical explanation to the origin of Cold War. This is also post-World War II view to the origin of Cold War. It assumes that at the end of the World War in 1945, the United States and Soviet Union were the only two superpowers which remained, along with other important powers like United Kingdom and France, but they had militarily weakened. There were a lot of sufferings in United Kingdom, France and other parts of Europe. But these two somehow remained very strong. So it is said that though the Americans and the Soviets had allied in the World War II, almost एक साथ आ गए थे वो एक पॉइंट पे to defeat the Axis powers. Axis powers कौन थे? Italy, Germany and Japan. Basically these were the three which were fighting these two. So these two had at that time World War II में आप देखेंगे तो ये दोनों साथ में आ गए थे to defeat these Axis powers. They didn't want anybody else to emerge as strong as them. So Axis powers being Italy and Germany and Japan. तो इन दोनों को हराने के लिए वो साथ में जरूर आ गए थे. But there was a lack of trust between these two always. And moreover, both were aspiring to achieve dominance in Europe and their aspirations were matched by their power and capability. Since both of them were militarily very strong and economically very sound, they both were equally very aspiring. So because they wanted to expand themselves, none of these two bowed down. That's why even if they fought the World War II together, after the World War II, they again, drifted apart. They moved apart. Okay, this is one explanation because owing to their power, capability, and the expansionist tendency कि हमें आगे बढ़ना है and urge to dominate. That's why Cold War happened and there was the bloc created. दूसरा explanation क्या कहता है? It is an ideological explanation. It says that geopolitical explanation does not tell the reasons for this lack of trust. Last में हमने जो बोला that both of them didn't trust each other. Despite they were fighting the war together, they never trusted each other. Why? Because this gap, जो ये gap है that what is the reason for the lack of trust is, it goes back to the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. What was the Bolshevik Revolution? Bolshevik Revolution was inspired by the ideology of communism, the ideology that espoused by the 19th century philosopher Karl Marx. It was basically success of a workers' revolution in Russia under the leadership of Lenin. That was looked at with suspicion and hostility by the capitalist classes in Europe. Capitalism यानी पूंजीवाद का जन्म बहुत पहले हुआ और समाजवादी सोच का जन्म जो है वो बहुत बाद में हुआ. So 1917 somehow उसने एक समाजवादी सोच की नींव रखी and very strongly it came out in open through USSR. So the US or the capitalist countries they started feeling threatened. So foremost, the success of the socialist revolution sent a very powerful and important message to the workers, peasantry, farmers and artisans and all other exploited class, जितने भी शोषित वर्ग हैं और जितने भी colonized people हैं जो उपनिवेशवाद के अंदर थे जितनी countries, उन सबको एक बहुत strong message है. और क्या था? The message was that it is possible to overthrow capitalism and its attendant colonialism and imperialism and liberate the exploited and oppressed classes and people. So this message went very strong because first time realized by the whole world that it is possible to fight the idea of पूंजीपतिवाद उस समय जब इंडिया में भी था. So obviously बहुत ज़्यादा शोषण इसके द्वारा किया गया and it was only about profit making. So the kind of suffering which had come to these oppressed classes and especially all these developing countries or underdeveloped countries, so this gave them an opportunity to think that क्या हम भी free हो सकते हैं. So is it possible कि हम इस पूंजीपतिवाद को का खात्मा कर सके and we will emerge as equals in the society or equals in the economic arena. So Soviet Revolution में वो hope जो है वो सबकी तरफ पहुंचाया. So Soviet Revolution greatly inspired people in the colonies, including India. So many began talking of liberating their own nations from the colonial rule and establish an egalitarian socialist order. Alright. So likewise, Soviet Revolution also galvanized the workers in Europe. जैसे इंडिया में उसने अपना impact दिखाया, वैसे यूरोप में भी दिखाया, चाहे वो जर्मनी हो, ब्रिटेन, फ्रांस, and Italy, where the communist and socialist parties suddenly they became very politically active, and a radical anticipation of workers' revolution was clearly seen in the future. So communist and socialist parties were formed in 20s in several Latin American countries also, and in European colonies in Asia and Africa. And an example would be the Communist Party of India, which was formed right after this revolution in 1925 to organize the peasantry and working class in the hope to attain some kind of freedom from this capitalist system. So ये था एक, this was one threat. Socialist revolution or the Soviet revolution did the message. It spread out to the whole world. Secondly, the Soviet revolution also offered a different paradigm of looking at international system, जो कि एक ही तरीके से चलता आ रहा था. It provided an opinion to otherwise that there is a possibility to build a new international system that would be based on solidarity and cooperation rather than based on competition and exploitation. So this hope also, divided and forced some countries to think in favor of Russia rather than America. So Russia was part of that allied force during the First World War, but it had withdrawn from the war after the revolution and abandoned all the secret military pacts and understandings for territorial expansion. It stopped in the midway. Russia withdrew its troops from everywhere. So it was earlier with Britain and other European powers, but after Bolshevik revolution happened, it withdrew because it realized that ideologically we are on two different paradigms. So promoting the new norms of international relations was not acceptable to great powers. They were used to wars, military alliances. They were used to this power to overseas colonies and spheres of influence to expansionism. Now, Soviet Union withdrew from the First World War. The European imperial powers requested the US to militarily intervene in Russia. But Russian Revolution had aroused great enthusiasm and hope amongst colonial people. So this was dangerous and unacceptable for colonial masters. Now clearly there was a divide which was seen between the exploited and exploiting class. So colonial masters were first time they received some sense of threat. So American expeditionary forces and those other allied countries, they intervened in Soviet Union in 1918. Okay, to prevent this, that don't spread this kind of message, that intervention lasted for several years. But an ideological justification was given that for this allied military intervention. Why did they attack Russia? It was said that the Bolshevik revolution was antagonistic to the values of freedom. In return, it is going to provide you with a totalitarian regime. So Americans claimed their own and the Russian Revolution was in danger of freedom and democracy. They said that socialism is basically totalitarianism and it negates democracy and human rights. Okay, whereas capitalism promises democracy, equal opportunity to everyone, economic growth, socialism is basically totalitarianism where one party will control over your life. So there won't be any personal growth, there won't be any economic growth experienced in these countries. This was their argument. That's why they said, इसी को prevent करने के लिए we are attacking Russia. So the ideological antagonism and political hostility remained with the post-1945 superpowers and contributed to widen the lack of trust between the two. Of course, it was not successful, but it widened the gap between the thought process. So very clearly, 45-46 में, this whole idea emerged that there are two blocks. One which was favoring socialism, which was favoring equality, which was favoring economic growth to everyone, and one was capitalism, which was favoring free trade, which was talking about equality, equal opportunity, and democracy. Yet at that time, it was also fused with a lot of exploitation. So these two camps clearly were visible. 1946 May, this all was another thing which happened was the Iron Curtain speech of former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Americans dropping an atom bomb on Japan. That increased the ideological rivalry between the two superpowers. So in addition to whatever was happening, 46 May formally Cold War की शुरुआत इसलिए हो गई. Two reasons. Immediate reason was Winston Churchill, who was the then Prime Minister in Britain. उनका एक speech जिसको Iron Curtain speech कहते हैं, वो आया. That Iron Curtain speech is basically considered to be the beginning of Cold War. तो और उसके साथ-साथ development ये था that Americans they dropped atom bombs at Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, that was most devastating, and that was the beginning of the Cold War, and all the it saw the division of the world complete. So now there were two blocks clearly, one which was favoring USA, one was favoring USSR. So the origin of the Cold War was pre-1945 in the ideological sense, in the sense that Bolshevik Revolution happened, that established socialism everywhere, and its vestiges are thought to remain in the post-1990 world too. So speaking in the US and joined in by the American President Harry Truman, Churchill declared, what did he say in his Iron Curtain speech was that from Sten in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Iron Curtain as in where we are no longer together. It can not move. There is a division. So this Iron Curtain speech is considered one of the most opening shots in the Cold War. Churchill also spoke of communist fifth columns that he said were operating throughout Western and Southern Europe. He talked of the threat of communism to the European colonies in Asia and Africa, which were fighting for their freedom and emancipation. So finally, Churchill asked the US to lead a free world against the threat posed by the communism in the world. So in open, Britain showed its allegiance to USA and asked USA to take over and free the world from the socialist doctrine and communism, and that's how it led to the West determining the half century to contain and roll back communism. That was the idea, to save the world against communism, free it, and otherwise freedom and democracy would never be experienced by these countries. And thus the determination became the essence of Cold War related interventions and wars, which happened during the following period of 45 to 1990. So this was the base, and it came out as Truman Doctrine. So Truman Doctrine meaning this whole idea emerged of Iron Curtain speech, which was the first and foremost, which opened the whole idea of Cold War and brought it in open to the whole world. Okay, so this is the background of Cold War. You have to understand how the countries were behaving at some time. So at the same time, they were militarily very, very strong, but they felt threatened in terms of ideological, the ideological thinking, which was gaining popularity in the world. So America and other these European powers were feeling threatened. Right. So let's look at the phases of the Cold War. There are three phases. It's difficult to, however, neatly identify the phases of the Cold War. Though the war had rising and falling tides of conflict, yet a period of relaxation of the tensions between the warring blocs is generally perceived, and that allows seeing the Cold War having phases or rising or declining tensions. So basically, we can study the Cold War in three phases. The first phase being the beginning and rising hostilities. कैसे Cold War का जन्म हुआ और क्या चीजें थी, क्या events थे which forced international relations thinkers to say that Cold War has begun or Cold War is taking place between these two. So क्या ऐसे छोटी-छोटी developments थे in the world which forced us to think that this was the era of Cold War, वो हम इस phase में देखते हैं. So the conferences that were held in Crimea's Yalta, Crimea में Yalta and Potsdam conferences हुए, German city Potsdam and Crimea में 1945 में could not provide an effective framework. These were basically held to how to renegotiate the German forces. That was the idea. So that's why the beginning of Cold War, हम लोग first reason जो trace करते हैं वो है Yalta conference or the Potsdam conference. They could not provide an effective framework. जैसे कि World War II end हुआ, these negotiations or rounds of treaties they started happening to deal with the post-war situation that had developed in Germany and in Eastern European states that were basically occupied by German forces. So they were trying to negotiate with the superpowers, trying to negotiate with the German forces. So Germany was basically divided into 4 occupation zones at that time, one under the control of Britain, France, Soviet Union, and United States. There were 4 zones. So these 4 powers were main participants in the Yalta conferences. They were trying to negotiate. The United States, on the other hand, at the same time, United States had detonated a nuclear device without the knowledge of its war allies. किसी को बिना बताए, it experimented and dropped them on Japan in 1945. It was an unprecedented display of the American power that led to its recognition as a superpower. Okay, so this established established that Americans are really powerful, America was powerful militarily and otherwise, and it was recognized as a former superpower. But at the same time, it also decreased its trust or trustworthiness in the eyes of Soviets and other allies, because उनको बिना बताए US ने, this was a secret mission. Meanwhile, क्या हुआ that the US economy was expanding very fast and had overtaken the combined economic strength of all the war-affected European states. Economically, it was so sound. The rate of industrialization of the post-1917 Soviet economy was also very impressive. So the weight of the American and Soviet military and economic strength were now being decisively felt in the Western and Eastern European countries respectively. So both were developing at a very faster pace. Economic strength, military strength, ever expanding, and that's why they gained they became the superpowers very quickly. So each of these superpowers eventually provided leadership to blocks that emerged on geopolitical and ideological grounds. Geopolitical, जो countries USA के आसपास थे, the Western European countries, and the USSR bloc was surrounded by the East European countries. That's how they created these two blocks. And ideological, because countries which were basically siding or leaning and supporting capitalism, and with USSR were the countries which were supporting the idea of socialism. Okay, so the United Nations Security Council in 1945 further provided a world stage to these powers to take on each other and play the card of the Cold War. Yes, the American President Harry Truman enunciated the so-called Truman Doctrine in 1947. Okay, this is one important landmark. जब आप लिखेंगे अपना answer, when we are writing about the origin of evolution of Cold War, when we are writing about the phase, you have to talk about these small landmark events. It's like a story. Okay, so what happens in Truman Doctrine? Let's just see. Truman Doctrine was an American strategy to contain communism. So now they came out in open in 1947 with the help of Truman Doctrine to tell the world that communist system was oppressive, and they warned against its possible subversive campaigns. So Truman's words were very signaling the American intention to resist the spread of communist system anywhere in the world, and that was exactly what happened in the following years and decades. So very openly they declared a war against the ideological expansion of Soviet. Okay. So Truman Doctrine is very important. You have to mention it when you talk about the origin of Cold War in 47. It was the idea first time Americans came out in open with their strategy. So they will do whatever they have to, militarily or otherwise, to stop the spread of communism everywhere across the globe. Okay. When the Soviet Union's Molotov plan came out in 1947, the United States rivaled with Marshall Plan. We have already discussed economic rebuilding के लिए Molotov plan was कि अपने allies को we will mutually provide them with aid and economic help so that they can rebuild themselves. And similarly, Marshall Plan came out in 48, and it was also the product of Truman Doctrine. That we also have to help our allies, and we will also tell them how to strengthen their bloc against the Soviet bloc. So as stated before, Soviet's Molotov plan had aimed at its Eastern European allies. Their economies were ailing and thus required reconstruction. So America's multi-billionaire Marshall Plan on the other side had a similar scheme for the post-war sick economies of the West European states. But ultimately, both these plans were the superpower strategy to contain each other and influence their own area of ascendancy. So by providing them aids and funds means that they wanted to mark out their territory. Alright. So these fish trap-like plans had left no trace of ambiguity of the breakout of geopolitical and ideological bloc rivalry that later came to be known as Cold War. So when the Soviet Union acquired nuclear capability in 1949, America had invited its European allies very same year and founded the NATO. The birth of NATO invited similar military response from the other bloc. So Soviet response was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, which is the Warsaw Pact in 55. Alright. So इधर से एक आ रहा है तो इधर से भी आ रहा है. That's what was going on. So strategies were devised, developed and thrown into open. And so Warsaw Pact was meant for cooperation between the Eastern European allies. Alright. So meanwhile, Chinese Communist Revolution was complete at that time in 1949, and a violent civil war had started in Korea. That is, we are talking about 1950s now. So by this time, Korea was already divided into two separate zones, North and South, North Korea and South Korea, because the Japanese soldiers had already surrendered to the Soviets in the North and to the Americans in the South, and that's how it got divided. So these developments had brought the bloc rivalry to Asia with high intensity of conflict and human suffering. So the China Communist Revolution and also the dividing up of two separate zones in the form of North Korea and South Korea brought this whole ideological and Cold War to Asian region also. Another very important event at that time was the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is called. So the worst had yet to come, and it was popularly called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now Cuba had seen a very successful revolution, Soviet revolution we are talking about, socialist revolution in 1959. Okay, among the things that followed the revolution was what happened at that time when socialist revolution happened in Cuba. It had a lot of bad impact on the economy or economic gains which America was reaping at that time from Cuba. What were they? It had a huge loss to the American private investors whose money was oiling at the Cuban sugar industry. Cuba, known for its sugar industry at that time, was a very, very important economic zone for American private investors. But because Soviet revolution happened there, these private investors suffered a huge loss. And another thing which happened was America failed to the invasion at Bay of Pigs. Also, it lost that war. Fidel Castro also emerged, declaring that Cuban revolution was socialist, and Cuba as Soviet ally to secure Soviet military support against the United States. He came out in open. Another thing which happened at that time was the reversal of Cuban sugar exports from the American market to the Soviet market. Now it started helping and aligning with the Soviets. So these developments provided great opportunity for the Soviet Union to increase its strategic weight against the United States. And it's installed its nuclear missiles in Cuba for its own security. Cuba, which is located in the Caribbean island, is barely 90 miles from the United States. Now, United States started feeling very insecure, and it started thinking that if the nuclear, experiments are conducted or placed so much near to us, it might provide a problem in the future. So the then American President Kennedy said that he would take whatever steps were necessary to protect American security, and thus he ordered blockade of Cuba, and he demanded removal of the nuclear missiles. So this Cuban Missile Crisis, as it is called, was basically when these two superpowers had a major intervention, and it moved very close to a nuclear war. It was that dangerous in the world, right? So Cuba at that point of time experienced the worst of its developments, and it had to suffer a lot. Okay, this was perhaps, these developments were more. Of course, there would be lot more events and developments when you read them in the book, but these are majorly what makes up to understand what was Cold War at this time, how it began. All these and many other small events together, they polarized the world. It established that there are two camps, two blocks. Either you go with this one or you go with this one. Okay. Now the second phase of Cold War is the phase which we call Beta. Okay. Now what is this Beta? Okay. What happened at that time was that diplomatic consigns, however, they prevailed over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the crisis had ended with the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba because American forced the USSR that they have to remove it from here. They were feeling quite insecure, and they took a promise for not to invade the island nation ever. Okay, so this was the negotiation, that you remove your missiles and we promise that we are not going to harm Cuba ever. That was the American promise. So this peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis probably made the world to realize that there is still a potential cost of bipolar military hostilities, and thus began a phase in the Cold War which is known as Beta. What is the definition of Beta? Let's look at it. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Politics, Beta refers to the periods of reduced tension in relation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and was closely associated with the process of arms control. Now, Cuban Missile Crisis not only posed a threat to USSR or US, but all the other countries also, and people realized that, if anything like World War happens, then it will no longer be merely a world war, but a nuclear war, and nobody wanted that kind of disruption. So Beta was an effort so that certain level of peace to be maintained. And how is that possible? By basically talking about arms control. Okay, now Americans, without anybody's knowledge, dropping bombs in Japan, and Soviet Union, planting its missile centers, or creating missile centers in Cuba, also threatened the whole world. So Beta was an effort whereby this mad rush towards arms can be controlled to maintain certain peace in the world. So the main period of Beta ran from the PTBT, that is Partial Treat Ban Treaty, in the 1963 to the late 1970s. So that was the period of Beta. The Cuban crisis hastened the PTBT agreement that was being negotiated since 1955. There were talks after the Warsaw Pact happened in 1955. There were talks that emerged that PTBT has to be signed, that nobody can, test without anybody's knowledge. It was signed. Then in 1963, finally, it was signed by the Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union, and agreed to limit the nuclear armaments to a bare minimum. You cannot just work on the nuclear strategy all the time. Okay, PTBT had banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, on the ground, and underwater. It, however, did not ban the underground testing. Talks to ban the underground testing could succeed only in 1996 under the CTBT, that is Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which India perhaps was never signed. But these powers had agreed to ban nuclear testing in the space in 1967. Apart from the underground testing, the ground testing, atmosphere testing, water testing, or space testing were entirely banned at that time. And also the entire Latin American region was declared nuclear weapon-free zone under the Treaty of Tlatelolco. That is a region in Latin America. So Britain, United States, and Soviet Union, they again signed NPT, this is Non-Proliferation Treaty, in 1968, and promised not to transfer such weapons to others. So this period is called Beta because this was the time when they realized that if all of us are strong enough, and if we do harm to another, we will not be probably spared. So all these developments were a result of the threat which was experienced by either of the blocks. Okay. So other developments other than these treaties which helped in arms control, other developments that had helped to relax the Cold War hostility were, first, there was a hotline link which was established first time between the leaders of Washington and Moscow, so that dialogues can take place between the two countries. The second being the two German states, that is Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, were recognized by the superpowers, and each were given membership of the United Nations. All right. The third development was that at that time West Germany, that is the Federal Republic of Germany, normalized its relations with East European states and the Soviet Union, which means that West Germany somewhere got aligned with Soviet Union. And then fourth one being America and the Soviet Union also signed. This was the period when they signed the SALT agreement, that is Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Okay, there were basically two rounds of bilateral treaty which happened between Soviet Union and USA, and it was regarded as having during the Cold War. So how can they limit their arms limited use of arms? That was the SALT agreement in 1972. One very important thing, that is the fifth reason when we say this was the Beta period, where the impact of Cold War was lying low, which was the famous Helsinki summit which was happening. It was held in 1975, and it was regarded as having buried the Cold War and symbolized the culmination of Beta in Europe. Some people also dubbed Beta as the end of Cold War. However, it was not end of Cold War. It was that period between the major Cold War, highly impacting Cold War events, and then there was a lull period which did not experience any military or intervention in the world, and where the whole idea was to contain the strategic aspirations of each and every country. This was Beta, and then after Beta, we also experienced the third phase, which is again the rebirth of Cold War. However, before going into that, let's quickly look into the Helsinki Accords. This is a very important one. All these, Beta period or the Helsinki Accords, you may get short notes to write short notes in your examinations point of view. Also, it's very important. So, what are the Helsinki Accords? Let's just quickly look into that. The Helsinki Declaration was an act to revive the sagging spirit of Beta between the Soviet Union and the United States and all its allies. This happened in 75. In 1975, the United States, Soviet Union, and all the members of NATO, as well as the Warsaw Pact, signed the Helsinki Final Act. So all of them came together during the meeting of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So Western Europe and Eastern Europe, they all came together. It was held in Helsinki, Finland. Beta literally means a lessening of tension between the two superpowers. That was a policy which was fashioned out by US President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The Helsinki Accords are a series of formal but non-binding agreements that were signed in August 1975. The Helsinki Accords dealt with three main issues. What are the three main issues? That is cooperation, security, and human rights. Cooperation as in economic and trade issues, security as in arms reduction, and protection of human rights for everyone. So under this Helsinki Accords, the nations of the East and the West, they all agreed to forge cultural links aimed at bringing the USA and USSR closer together. So basically, these rounds of peaceful talks were taking place where they wanted to move together, move a little closer. It was agreed that the parties would recognize the borders of Eastern Europe, the countries which were not yet recognized by United Nations, that were established at the end of Second World War, and in return, the USSR promised to uphold basic human rights that included allowing people in the Eastern Bloc the right to move across borders. Somewhere within that socialist regime, there was a lack of freedom which was experienced by the Eastern Bloc, where they were not allowed to physically also move across borders. And after this Helsinki Accord, it was possible for the Eastern European countries. So in brief, Helsinki Accords or treaty or summit were an attempt to improve diplomatic and political relations between these two antagonistic blocs, USA and USSR. The participating states reaffirmed their commitment to peace, security, and justice, and the continuing development of friendly relations and cooperation. There were 35 countries who signed the Helsinki Agreement, and following were the principles. What were the principles? First is that sovereign equality and respect for the rights inherent in sovereignty, refraining from the threat or use of force. Third is that inviolability of frontiers. Fourth is territorial integrity of the states. Fifth is peaceful settlement of disputes. Sixth is non-intervention in internal affairs of any country. Seventh is respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Eighth being equal rights and self-determination for people, especially minorities and ethnicities. Ninth being the cooperation among states. 10th, the fulfillment in good faith of obligations under international law. So Helsinki Accords was viewed as a significant step towards reducing Cold War tensions, but at the same time we also realized that Helsinki spirit was very weak and the revival of that proved to be very short-lived. So as a result, what happens? What happens is the third phase of Cold War. So we had the first phase where we see Cuban Missile Crisis and a lot of other events which led to devastation and polarization of two blocks. The second phase is Deta, where there was a hope with the help of Helsinki that there could be peace established, and the third phase is rebirth and end of Cold War. Now just take a closer look at that. So Deta, third phase में क्या हुआ है? Let's just see. Deta was in effect for around 1.5 decades, 1975 से लेकर almost 80 years में रहा. So many had just believed that the Cold War has ceased to exist. As I told you, a lot of people think that Deta means end of Cold War, but the belief soon was shattered. कैसे? Because a communist regime came to power in Afghanistan. Now with the development of these developments which happened in Afghanistan, probably we see there was a rebirth of Cold War. क्या हुआ? देखते हैं. So now there was a communist regime which came in power in Afghanistan, and the country soon plunged into civil war, with deep involvement of the United States and the Soviet Union reveling each other in the land of the South Asian nation. Afghanistan had a monarchy, king system, which was abolished by Muhammad Daud Khan in 1973, and he himself became the president of the newly founded republic. Daud saw a possible threat from its neighbor Pakistan. Pakistan was continuously receiving military assistance from the United States, and therefore Afghanistan sought weapons from the Soviet Union to balance Pakistan. So that's how they seek help from Soviet Union. So the Soviet weapons did arrive in Afghanistan, and it was interpreted as strengthening Daud's hand, and also the Afghan communist who had helped Daud ascending the presidential office in Kabul. So there was a message which was clear that Afghanistan was aligning or siding with Soviet Union. This situation soon went out of control when Daud was ousted in 1978 by his supporters, and his supporters were sent in exile. So riots broke out in Afghanistan with worsening economic condition. Meanwhile, the American ambassador was killed in a riot-like situation. So the following year, Hafizullah Amin became president of Afghanistan, who thought, though a veteran of communists, was not liked by Soviets at all. Thus, over 90,000 Soviet troops, they entered Afghanistan in 1979, as they had thought that this country may swing to the American side under Amin. To prevent that, the troops were stationed in Afghanistan in 1979. With Soviet support, Babrak Karmal was made president after Amin's execution. So Amin was executed, and Karmal was, he replaced him as a new president. So this new regime in Afghanistan was opposed by a section of Afghan population who had been onslaught on their religious rights, as the government was encouraging secular practices in daily life. So this was termed as anti-Islamic and promotion of Western culture, etc., etc. So these developments in Afghanistan were termed by the United States as deliberate acts of Soviet Union to promote communist ideology, and that led to re-emergence or revival of the Cold War in a very significant way. So now what happens is that the United States responded to these developments with its proxies in Afghanistan. उन्होंने अपने जो लगाए हुए लोग थे अफगानिस्तान में उनको काम पे लगा दिया, and that Mujahideen group, as it was called, launched a war on the communist regime of Karmal. So Soviet Union suffered heavy military losses there. US armed Mujahideen groups created a lot of ruckus and devastation. Besides, by that time, it was 80s we are talking about, the Soviet Union had also, in its home, had begun unraveling under the pressure of perestroika and glasnost reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev. So Soviet troops began withdrawing from Afghanistan because they could not sustain so much loss, and they started going back. So till mid-1988, they left the country on 15 February 89. So without victory under the framework which was worked out between US, USSR and the governments of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The other developments that were seen, which was adding to the rebirth of Cold War, were, this was one, Afghanistan, because the main reason. The first one was imposition of martial law in Poland by the Soviets in 1981 to quell pro-democracy protests and its American opposition. So a lot of violence, happened in Poland to oppose the protests which were going on. They were pro-democracy at that time. Second is that the Soviet Union shooting down a South Korean spy airliner in 1983, and thus it breaking off the Soviet-American arms talks. They had a pact to upkeep the peace in that region, and Soviet Union broke that promise by shooting down and striking down a South Korean spy airliner in 1983. Another development which led to, again, intensifying of these rivalry was that American invasion of Grenada, a Caribbean country, again in 1983. So it invaded, and so that also means that America also broke its promise against keeping peace in the Caribbean region. After Cuban Missile Crisis, it had promised that it will maintain peace and no military conflicts or wars will be waged in this area. So this geopolitical and ideological battle, however, was ended by the late 1980s. Once the Soviets had pulled out its troops from Afghanistan, the bipolar tension reduced. Both were there, that's why there were a lot of destructions going on in a very intense situation. But when the Soviet Union receded back, stepped back, and they pulled out the troops from Afghanistan, of course, this tension decreased a little bit. The Americans and the Soviets, they agreed to dismantle a whole category of nuclear weapons in 1987. They reached an agreement to that effect. It was called the INF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. This was the name of the treaty which was signed in 1987. So news of positive development in favoring of easing of the tensions started coming from Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, everywhere. There were lessening of tensions. And Germany was united. But it was widely believed that the policies pursued by the Soviet leadership of that time were primarily responsible for the end of Cold War. What were these policies? The essence of those policies pursued by Soviet Union were understood by two highlighted terms. These are called the perestroika and glasnost. The literal meaning being perestroika means restructuring, economic restructuring, and glasnost means opening up. Okay, so basically, this was Gorbachev's plan in the sense of removing economic bottlenecks, inefficiency, and raising production and productivity. Political liberalization is basically was aimed in Soviet political system for minimal political liberalization. That's why they started easing up their policies. So it called for openness in public policy making and scrutiny. But the fact is that both these policies, perestroika and glasnost, would not help the Soviet much. And finally, Soviet Union got disintegrated. It broke in 1991. Okay, so this marked the end of Cold War and also beginning of an era where America was perhaps emerged as the only superpower which had triumphed over other ideologies as well. So quickly, the end of Cold War, when Michael Gorbachev came to power, relations between Soviet Union and US began to improve. Gorbachev initiated glasnost and perestroika to provide some small political opening at home and to bolster the political economy, to help the economic structure. Okay, so Cold War began winding down. At a summit in Iceland in October 1986, Gorbachev proposed Reagan a 50% reduction in nuclear arsenals of each side. Nothing came out of it, as Reagan was not interested in building his New START program. So, however, on December 8, 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which we have talked about, INF Treaty, was signed. So, that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. The INF Treaty was the first arms control pact to require an actual reduction in nuclear arsenals rather than merely restricting their proliferation. So, it was not only about sharing the information or not; it was about reducing these nuclear strategies. So, as the decade came to an end, much of the Eastern Bloc began to fall apart. Alright, because there was economic stagnation and countries were not experiencing any economic boom. There was poverty and hunger, and country after country they walked back on communism and rather adopted capitalism. And the Soviet Union could do nothing in response. The so-called Iron Curtain was finally crumbling. There was no Iron Curtain now because the whole world was somehow moving slowly towards capitalism. On November 10th, 1989, German people also divided. Decades physically tore down the Berlin Wall. They were divided along the ideological divide, socialism and the capitalist bloc. So the Berlin Wall also collapsed. The collapse of Berlin Wall was one of the famous symbols of Cold War. So before the 1989 would end, leaders of every Eastern European nation except Bulgaria had been ousted by popular uprisings. There were major protests and rebellions happening, and most of the countries would leave communism and socialism and probably opt for capitalist economic system. So by late 1991, Soviet Union itself dissolved into its component republics under a mix of factors. There was economic pressure, the war in Afghanistan, breaking away of its Eastern European allies. They became very weak. There was no more unity. There were no friends. In a sense, that Soviet socialist experiment crumbled under its own weight. It was a defeat of socialism at the political, if not the ideological level. But did it mark the triumph of capitalism and liberal democracy? Yes, it did, because most of the countries today also are under, they are part of this formal system, which is capitalist economic system, and political system, which is most popular, is the liberal democracy. So US emerged as the sole superpower and took great credit for ending the Cold War. Triumphalism prevailed in US, a sense in American destiny and its infallibility. To end this session, I would like to pick a quote from Francis Fukuyama. He declared the end of Cold War as the end of history. He says that it is not only the end of Cold War, but it also marks the end of history. Human societies will no further evolve in economic and political terms. Why would he say that? Because the free market capitalism and liberal democracy, they were seen as the final forms of economic and political systems to live in. So bipolarity ended and US became the sole superpower in the international relations. This basically marks the end of Cold War and beginning of a new era, which talks about how now US controls or emerges as a sole superpower in the international field. That we will discuss later. So tomorrow is we are going to continue a discussion on the post-Cold War era. For now, we have covered the first topic from the first unit. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. Vishalji.
Hello.
Yeah, Vishalji. Yeah, I think I'll continue tomorrow. Okay. Time ho gaya hai. I'll continue tomorrow. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.